guys would take your seats, we'll get started. Matt, are we waiting on Louis? Okay. I was told we were. Anyway, my name is Bill Kerrigan. I'm with AIAG. I'm here to moderate this session this morning. I want to say good afternoon to everyone. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. I want to thank the Ultimedia team for having us here today and putting on another exceptional conference. This is Finished Vehicle Logistics. In case you're in the wrong room, you can leave now. That means juice winners. The panel we have today is, we've assembled a lot of really smart people from what I call the three modes of our finished vehicle logistics train, ocean, rail, and truck. And they're going to talk a little bit about external factors in our industry today. It's one would be regulations, obviously, another would be human resources. You know, it's not as if we have enough problems, right? We got another 3 million cars coming into the pipeline in the next 5.5, 6 years that we're going to have to handle. We got unpredictable weather. We got longer finished vehicle logistics supply chains. And now we have a whole new bunch of regulations that are going to be coming down after us. So they each have a presentation to make. I'm sorry, I forgot about Evan too. He's going to represent the port side of the business. But to start off, we have Linda Brandel. She's VP of Automotive for Union Pacific Railroad, and she's got a presentation she'd like to go through.
The right after lunch slot. All right, we'll see how this goes. Okay, so this morning, if you were in the other panel, Dave Fleener talked about rail foamers. We like to call them rail fans. And for the rail fans in the audience, that beautiful automotive train photo was taken at Yuba Gap, California, between Reno and Sacramento. That's a westbound train, probably going from Chicago to Northern California. So there's my rail commercial for the day. I'm going to talk about a couple of things today. So on the agenda, I'm going to give some perspective on railroad hiring. So we're doing all kinds of hiring, give you some thoughts around that. And then instead of go through the gamut of regulations that we're under, there's a newly proposed rule out there related to hazardous trains that you might not think is important, but it's really important. So we're going to talk about that. Before we start down that path, I'm going to start with just the quick rail overview, and you got some of this earlier this morning. But there are 560 railroads in the U.S., 7 large Class 1s, 21 regionals, multiple short lines. We have about 140,000 mile integrated network right across the country. We've got about 1.5 million freight cars that we run over that network, and combining capital and maintenance. So this morning you heard about the capital spend overall, and we'll spend in capital about $26 billion this year. It usually ranges around that $25 billion mark collectively. If you add maintenance expenses to that, equipment, locomotives, you're looking at about 40 cents of every revenue dollar that's spent and put back into the rail network. We are privately owned, full tax-paying companies. The only major transportation mode in the country whose infrastructure is wholly owned and funded by ourselves. And as we heard about this morning, in other countries, most rail networks in the world are subsidized. Amtrak is subsidized, passenger rail is subsidized in the U.S. So normally in other countries, the railroads are owned by the government or some sort of government entity. So people, right, personnel are critical to railroad operations. We've been aggressively hiring and training. These are industry slides. Okay, AAR for the Association of American Railroad Industry slides that give you some historical perspective on the right. Just follow the graph, right? That's Class 1 total employees over time. You can see the economic downturn, and you can see the sharp uptick beginning this year. And then, so that represents about a 3% increase so far this year in total railroad employment. On the train and engine side, those are the people who are out actually operating the trains, right, critical to the service. the hiring there has been at a 4.1% pace so far this year. So that's January through July 2014. For context, if you look at U.S. employment rates, were up 1.1% in that same time frame. So no other industry that we can find has a higher hiring rate than what we've seen on our transportation and engine side. There are only a handful who've hired as much as railroads have overall. So a lot of hiring going on, and as an external factor, there are a lot of issues that come along with that, right? So you're hiring from the outside. I'm going to spend a few minutes giving you some perspective. When we hire train and engine employees, it can take a full year to get them hired, up to speed, and ready to go in their assignments. So I'm going to give you some UP perspective on this, okay? So this slide, if you look at the bars, this is what our company looked like in 2004, 10 years ago. And these are our employees covered by collective bargaining agreement who are 80+% of our total population. This is an age and years of service look. And so 10 years ago, we were looking at more than half of our employees who were looking forward to retirement in the next 10 years. Okay, big challenge if you think about that. You fast forward that 10 years, and so over the last 10 years, we had a pretty concerted effort to even that out. Okay, so all kinds of people coming into the company, reduce the experience drain, right? Everybody faces that when you have employees who are ready for retirement, and there are a lot of them all at once. That's a big experience drain that you see happening over time that you have to deal with. On the rail side, we've heard a lot about increasing demand, waning demand. Okay, that can cause some real issues from an employment perspective when it takes a year to bring somebody on board. So even though we need more people now, there are times when you're furloughing people or putting people not in the active workforce for a period of time. That typically hits the employees that are on the left-hand side of the age years of service equation, right? So one of the things UP did around the downturn time, instead of having those employees go straight to furlough, we created an alternative work schedule program. Okay, so those employees would work 8 days a week, maintain full benefits, keep their connection to the railroad, maintain their training, and that paid off for us big time this year. We had about 800 employees that were brought back into the fold very quickly, as opposed to having completely lost their connection with the railroad and gone out to other industries. So, even with that, even with our ability to bring those folks back quickly, we've doubled our hiring projections just for this year based on the demand that we've seen. If you think about the future and the challenges on the human resources and the personnel side, and these same things apply, I think, in many industries. By 2018, there is a projection that the U.S. will be short about 5 million mid-skilled workers. Mid-skilled workers are people who have a high school degree, but they don't have a four-year college degree. And there are a lot of those folks that work in railroad positions. So we're looking at that as a potential headwind in hiring going forward. The military has been a fantastic hiring pool for railroads. In fact, 1 out of every 5 UP employees has a military background, and some are still active in the Guard or the Reserves. For right now, with the military downsizing, that's helping with a pool of potential candidates for employment. Going forward, as the military is downsized, that's less of a pool eventually to draw from. Okay, so that's a potential opportunity for us looking forward. STEM. So the very first panel this morning, we talked about STEM careers, the science, technology, engineering, math degrees. The demand for STEM employees across the U.S. has grown significantly, increased by more than 30% in the U.S. over the last 10 years. STEM hires are very valued. At my railroad, I expect other railroads, and across the automotive industry. So one of the things that we're looking at is that there are different ways to look at women and minorities, but more than half the population is on a very limited basis engaged in engineering careers, right? 14% of women are in engineering careers. So when you have half your population that's not doing that, any of you who have daughters, highly encourage them to think about careers here. Their opportunity is just enormous. You know, at UP, we reach out at the middle school level in our market, because middle school is when those young women are deciding that maybe it's cool, that engineering and math and science is okay. You can go ahead and do that. So that's one of the things we're doing there. Generational diversity, and you'll probably hear more of this. This is not a UP railroad issue or any other, particular industry issue for us, but the generational differences in employees is pretty significant. You know, if we look at how that's changing between baby boomers and the generation X and Y, you know, we're about a third, and a third right now. But as the younger employees move into positions, they've grown up with a whole different technology background, different way of learning, different way of working, many applications for us in connecting and reaching those employees and working with them going forward. So this is really, I mean, these are the kinds of things that our HR team and really our whole company is wrapped around when we think about how do we hire, advance, and retain the talent and the workforce that we need going forward. So I'm going to switch gears, talk about the regulatory front a little bit. So railroads are subject to all kinds of regulations today. They range from emissions to hours of service and training requirements for employees to regulatory protections around unreasonable pricing and activity to requirements for technology like positive train control. Right? Positive train control is technology that was mandated in 2008 to be put in place by 2015 on technology that really didn't exist. Right? So all kinds of regulations that come into play here. Lots of parties who get excited about proposing new regulations for railroads is something that we have experienced, at least in my 26-year career with Union Pacific. I've seen multitudes of things come through. But every time one of these comes through, you really need to pay attention and be really thoughtful about it, because the devil is always in the details, and there are always unintended consequences. So if you think about what's happening now, you know, there have been a number of service hearings, right? So we've talked about rail service, a number of service hearings, and you would think that most of them are all about how do you speed up rail service, right? And how do you prioritize my commodity? There's a lot of that, right? The grain needs to be prioritized, or the fertilizer. You get some of that, but how do you speed it up? There is a brand new proposal on the table. Okay, this is real and current. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. It's related to flammable liquids and concerns about safety in transporting crude oil. Okay, so that's a hot topic. It's come up. It's not intuitive that anything that would be associated with flammable commodities impacts automotive, but it most certainly does. So what do we got here? Okay, so August 1, just this year, the Pipeline and Hazardous Material Safety Administration, PHMSA, I'm going to call them PHMSA, released an NPRM, Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. This was about transporting crude oil, ethanol, other flammable liquids. So they're part of the DOT. Now, nobody likes acronyms more than railroads, but the government, I think. We've got a lot of them. So they want to add, remove, change a rule. They published this on August 1. There are public comment window that's open right now, 60 days. And here's what this does. Okay, so 3 things to understand. First of all, the scope of this puts restrictions on any train that has at least 20 or more tank cars of flammable liquids in it. Okay, so the scope covers all tank cars containing flammable liquids, not just crude oil. Okay, so that's the first thing to think about. And it defines a train as a high hazard freight train if it has 20 cars on it in any form, not just as a unit train, not just as a block. If there are 20 cars on it, it's an HHFT, high hazard freight train. Okay, so what that meant for us when it went from just a ruling about crude oil to broadening that scope, it took it up by 2.5 times what it would have impacted to start with. Okay, so right there, the scope is a big deal. Speed restrictions associated with this would have every one of those trains with a speed limit, so a maximum speed limit of 40 miles an hour. Okay, today, we restrict the speed on crude oil trains going through high threat urban areas, HTUAs, at 40 miles an hour. As soon as you put this rule out there, and at a minimum, you're talking about that on all of this defined scope trains. At a minimum. At a maximum, those trains are 40 miles an hour maximum across the entire network. Okay. Another part of this rule that's in the fine print is a requirement to implement something called electronically controlled pneumatic brakes. Okay. What that does theoretically is have a quicker pulse signal to tell the car to stop than what they currently have today. The problem is the technology doesn't work. Okay? So you're talking about a requirement and a mandate to retrofit the brakes on these cars, and if you have these cars in a manifest train, that means everything in the train gets restricted to those types of brakes on a system that doesn't work. Doesn't replace the air requirement. You still have the air requirement to flow through the train, but this is a mandate that's on there. All right, so why are we talking about this? Okay, very real, very current, very impactful. This is about 3% of our shipments, but very widespread impact. So the speed restrictions, okay, hit everything. So you're talking about velocity across the entire network. Some areas overall 2 to 4 mile an hour impact, which for railroads is a huge deal. That's a huge deal. More congestion, higher transit times, growth capacity gets taken out because now we know about cycle times in automotive. The slower the cycle times, the less capacity you have. So you're filling up that capacity in some pretty key corridors for us. Chicago, LA is impacted significantly. The north-south between the upper Midwest and Texas and Mexico is a significant part of this. One thing I heard was if you think the weather was a major impact on rail, well, let's put that into play with a regulation that requires it to happen all the time like that. So very concerned about this. Lots of money required to replace that. Probably not going to happen very easily. But it's hard to argue with safety, right? So it's a soundbite. You hear somebody says safety or somebody says competition, right? Those are words that are hard to argue with. Safety is embedded in everything we do. We don't want to have an accident with any of these trains, hands down, no doubt. You have to think about it, though, in terms of how do you maximize safety without significantly impacting a network fluidity and your ability to grow and impacting all kinds of customers in that. So what we're doing about it, we're going to comment on it. Formally, we'll comment with the AAR. We want to talk about the scope of this. Should it really be crude oil, or do you really want to expand it? We'd like to limit the restrictions to certain configurations on trains, which we know makes a big difference. Is it 20 block cars versus anything spread throughout a train? That makes a difference for whether it's safe or not. The speed restrictions really should be through the high threat urban areas, not widespread across the railroad. The braking piece, the technology isn't there to make it work. That was an add-on that should have never been included. And then the tank car standards that we're talking about, we've already as an industry agreed on tank car standards with the American Petroleum Institute. These are different standards again, right? So we'll be working through that. If you're worried about this, come talk to me later. There are some things you can do about it. But I put that up there because this is just one example of well-meaning regulatory proposals that get put on the table that really have a much bigger impact than I think is anticipated and needs to be known. So this is important. We have external influences, regulatory impacts across all of our industries, right? The key is to make sure that you are paying attention, not just hearing the sound bites, right? Don't just hear the sound bites. Understand it, know what it means, take action on it if it doesn't seem to make sense, and move from there. So that's my core message about regulatory. And I'm going to just finish with the capital slide, right? I could have put up an industry capital slide. This is the UP capital slide. You know, regulation makes a big difference on investment, okay? So to the extent you have some certainty, you can invest. To the extent you have a lot of uncertainty, it makes it much more difficult to do that. We're putting $4.1 billion into our infrastructure this year. Railroads collectively, since Staggers Act in 1980, have put $525 billion back into the network, right? So we're maintaining a privately owned steel highway system on our own that from a regulatory perspective, if you put this kind of stuff on there, makes it very difficult to invest in. I'll wrap it up, right? I'll wrap it up and just say whatever external factors, regulatory issues you have, you need a healthy business model. Okay, so regulations are meant to support a business model, not to take it out or take it down. And that's the message I would leave you with, is to pay attention to some of this stuff because it's pretty meaningful and hits with a pretty high magnitude in a whole lot of areas. Okay, and I'll turn it back to Bill.
Gee, they do things in Washington we don't know about all the time, do they? Next up, we're going to have a representative from one of the ports on the East Coast. Ports are very important, obviously, in the FVL chain to represent a lot of infrastructure, a lot of capital investment, especially in land, usually partnerships between state and cities and counties and private entities. Next speaker is Evan Matthews, who's the Port Director for the Port of Davisville. I remember Davisville from late in the 80s when I was at Wallenius Lines because we were bringing Peugeots in there at the time. And they certainly come a long way since then, and it's one of the premier railroad ports on the East Coast right now. Evan.
Thank you very much, and a shout out to Automotive Logistics. I don't think I'm going to violate any copyrights during my presentation. So I'm just going to give a little overview of the port, and then I'm going to go into, I guess, external factors for ports as code for environmental regulation. So I'm going to go over some of the things that we're working on. The Port of Davisville is owned and operated by a quasi-public agency called the QUONSET Development Corporation, which is basically the remnants of the Rhode Island Port Authority. The state of Rhode Island hasn't been very good in terms of branding its ports, so we keep changing the name every 4 or 5 years, but the bills of ladings have always said the Port of Davisville, so that's what we're sticking to. We're part of a 3,200-acre complex that was 2 former Navy installations, and we have about 175 companies and about 9,500 jobs on the premises. For those of you who aren't familiar, we are in Rhode Island, and we're basically right along the northeast corridor of the United States, U.S. East Coast. And since 1996, our volume has increased 5-fold, and then the last 5 years alone, we've had an 87% growth, mainly due to our processor, North Atlantic Distribution. In terms of regulatory challenges, I'm going to talk a little bit about permitting and financing dredging, under unpredictable federal funding sources, stormwater management and water quality, storm vulnerability and resiliency, which the federal government is now talking a lot about since Hurricane Sandy, and then local permitting for new projects outside the terminal. In terms of permitting, Davisville is one of the few ports that's exempt from the harbor maintenance tax and is outside of the Army Corps program for funding dredging projects, which is great for our OEMs who don't have to pay the harbor maintenance tax, but that means that we have to come up with the money. We still have to dredge. So that's been a big challenge for us, but we were able to, with our own funds and through just using our own resources, we're able to permit a new project that was completed to bring the terminals down to 32 feet. I know some of our major OEMs were concerned about that, so we're able to get that done, but that was obviously a challenge. I know some of the other ports have been trying to get dredging projects done through the Army Corps process. I think Delaware has been waiting for 25 to 30 years, so it's definitely something that could be a lot easier and would make the ports more responsive. In terms of, we've been really successful at getting federal grants, but I know that the Maritime Administration loves to talk about the Tiger grants, and I know a lot of ports, railroads, people have gotten those Tiger grants, but ports are the one aspect of the federal, or of the transportation system that doesn't have a federal agency funding it. And so a lot of the challenges in capital planning, if you're trying to rely on grants, they're competitive, and if you're trying to tell your customers that you're going to expand the terminal and then you don't get the grants, that's definitely a challenge for that. And then when you do get a grant, we were very successful. We got a $22.3 million Tiger grant. These are some of the projects that we were able to execute with it. But one of the things that is a challenge is stormwater management. I know a lot of the terminals that we inherited from the Navy were built without modern stormwater management. So when you go and retrofit your terminals and you're adding a lot of laydown, you have to put in very expensive stormwater systems. A lot of them have to be put underground, under the terminal, which you have to watch in terms of, especially if you're doing high and heavy, what you're going to do to that infrastructure underneath. And water quality is always an issue when you're talking about expanding near the water. One of the things that's come up again since Hurricane Sandy is a lot of federal agencies are talking about storm vulnerability and your port's resilience. One of the things that, right now, today, we're lucky that we can move most of our product out of the flood zone. We can do it pretty quickly, but when you're talking about big storms, they move up. You only have about 72 hours notice. One of the things that we're watching is, is the federal government going to, mandate new elevations? Are they going to, is local zoning going to require that all of your new structures are going to be elevated? It's something that obviously it's more expensive to do that. So that's something that we're really talking about. And obviously the Coast Guard looks at ports and how, their resiliency plan. So that's something that we're looking at. And then obviously, when you're talking about processing facilities and attracting, new customers, the ability to go and execute facilities. A lot of times you can have everything in place, but fire code, building code, all of those things come into play and affect the timing of those projects. And when you're talking about convincing people to change their supply chains, you have to have a lot of certainty. So what we've done to combat that is to go and pre-permit most of the remaining parcels in the 3,200 acres. Here's an example of some of those things to really basically take the risk out of it so that all of the permits are in place for the maximum build out of the parcels. So those are some of the things that we're trying to do to mitigate those external factors. So thank you.
Thanks, Evan. Next on deck, Bob Farrell. Bob's Executive Director of the ATA, the Automobile Carriers Conference, and he's going to go through a few slides also today on some regulations which are affecting his people. Bob? Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. Excuse me. I'm going to start with hours of service. My whole presentation will be based on some of the negative impacts of our regulations, but specifically addressing the driver and the driver shortage. We have the hours of service, which you all know about. The rule went into effect July 1 last year, and it includes a controversial rest break requirement and a restart for 34 hours. Our research arm, the American Transportation Research Institute based in Atlanta, did a study, or a survey, if you will, covering 2,300 drivers and 446 motor carriers. Now, these were drivers and motor carriers across the entire spectrum of the trucking industry. And the results, or as they say on TV, survey shows, on the carrier findings, 80% of respondents lost productivity. 49.9, almost 50% of the carriers require more drivers to haul the same freight. It says, and 22.7% had to raise driver pay, and 15% had to add more equipment just to handle the same volume of freight. Drivers How do they feel about the new hours of service regulations? 49% said the new regs had negative impact on the quality of life. 38.5% were somewhat more fatigued, while 28% were more fatigued with the restart provisions. 67% said their pay had decreased nearly 20%. Excuse me, with nearly 20% saying their pay had decreased from 5 to 10%. That's significant. No wonder why we can't find drivers. What's the latest on the hours of service? There's been a lot of talk. The ATRI, again, did a study, and that should say FMCSA, which is Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, overstated the benefits and understated the impact it would have on the trucking industry. Congress mandated a 34-hour restart study by the General Accountability Office. That's already law. There's a possible legislative fix to suspend the 34-hour restart pending the GAO study. The U.S. Senate has passed the DOT appropriation bill, and included in that bill is language which the industry supports, sponsored by Senator Susan Collins from Maine, that says FMCSA would suspend the 34-hour restart pending the outcome of the GAO study. That language is not in the House version. However, we have been told by the Transportation Infrastructure Committee's leadership that when the Senate version gets to the House, they will adopt the Senate language. So if Congress ever gets their act together and does some appropriation bills, we have a good chance that the hours of service language will stay in the bill. In addition to hours of service and effects on drivers, we have a pending ELD rule, electronic logging devices. New acronym, it used to be called onboard recorders. But now they feel that electronic logging devices have a more positive connotation. We expect that to come out at the beginning of next year with an implementation date for 24 months after that. We're also looking at a drug and alcohol clearing registry that would be a one-stop location for all drug and alcohol testing studies, or tests, excuse me. Then there's also possibly a sleep apnea study. Gee, I need to lose some weight or else I can't drive a truck, because it's not healthy for me. Then we have CSA, which I'm not even going into, a comprehensive safety analysis by DOT, because it is so, I've been speaking all afternoon and I'm not the expert on it. It's such a quagmire. And also in our driver ranks, we have retirements. As Linda pointed out, the workforce is aging. Plus we have other federal agencies that impact the trucking industry that you're all aware of. We have OSHA, we have Department of Labor, everybody else you could think of with the alphabet soup initials. And also we're experiencing economic growth, which makes it harder on the driver pool, which all leads us to driver hiring issues. According to an ATA survey, and this is a survey done by across all motor carriers, as I said, not just car haul, 77% of carriers say that it's a challenge to find a driver. 88% are getting enough applicants, but they aren't good applicants. It's quality, not quantity. We predict 96,000 new drivers are needed per year, and by 2022, we're going to have a supply shortage of 240,000 drivers across the trucking industry. Another issue that we look at, this effect has a negative effect on the trucking industry. GHG, fuel economy standards, greenhouse gases. The Obama administration is committed to round 2 of this program. The proposed rule should be out next spring. Final rule probably a year after that. To be part of the president's climate legacy. Implementation, 2020, 2021? Don't know yet. What do we expect in round 2 of the greenhouse gas emissions rules? Well, they're looking at possible separation requirement for engines, the vehicles, and a trailer. There's discussions now, do we put a GHG rule for the truck or the components in the combination? We have been successful in our discussions with the government so far that the trailer would be defined as a box trailer and not a car haul trailer. What are they looking at? Waste heat recovery. I'm not an engineer, I don't know what that is. Advanced transmissions, advanced tires, aerodynamics, hybrids. There's going to be a role for natural gas and other technologies and alternative fuels. Linda mentioned earlier about the train brake rule technologies in there. Well, we have gone through 3 EPA-mandated engines in the trucking industry. The first one went in 2002. Look at truck warranty, engine warranty costs in 2003. The next one went in January of 2007. And the last one went in 2010. So the initial technology that was forced upon the trucking industry in regard to their engines wasn't there. It didn't work. And now we have these new engines. And how are they affecting car haul? Well, they're more expensive, as you all know. They take up more room because we have to burn off the pollutants. And what's that do? It reduces our cargo carrying capacity due to the increase in the size of the cab. So it's a domino effect. The tractor gets bigger, you gotta push something back, boom, boom, boom. You can only have 75 feet, you're gonna lose something. And that's not a good thing to go. One thing I'd also like to point out, as I mentioned earlier, FMCSA is the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. Their directive is to ensure motor carrier safety on the highway. The trucking industry is the only transportation mode within the country that does not have a regulatory agency that advocates on behalf of the trucking industry. FAA advocates on behalf of airlines. FRA advocates on behalf of railroads. Maritime Administration advocates on maritime. FMCSA, motor carrier safety. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob. Just full of good news, aren't you?
Yeah. I try. It's either it's either I'm the dope from Washington or I'm from Washington with the dope.
Last but certainly not least, we have Eric Nyam. He's the Chief Commercial Officer for Wallenius Wilhelmsen Logistics, and he's going to talk to you about what we have coming up on the ocean side of the business. Eric?
Thank you, Bill. That's a lot of external factors already today, and I'll give you just one more. From our side, we believe there is one factor that stands out to have a very noticeable impact on finished vehicle logistics, namely the upcoming sulfur emissions. And I'm sure most of you here have heard about the regulations. I'm less sure everyone understands their significance. The sulfur regulations impact bunker costs, which for any shipping company is by far the largest cost element. And what we're talking about is a 50% increase on that cost. So before moving on, I'd like to stress that we fully recognize that tens of thousands of premature deaths every year are caused because of maritime sulfur emissions. So that underscores the necessity of the regulations. Nevertheless, they also do pose an unprecedented cost and compliance challenge to the shipping industry. So let me give you a quick recap of the regulations. Today, vessels can run on low sulfur bunker to meet the 1% emission standards within the ECAs. In just 3.5 months, January 2015, a new stringent emission standard of 0.1% will be imposed on IMO's ECAs. That includes waters off the North American coast, the North Sea, and the Baltic Sea. And on the high seas, the limit will be reduced from 3.5% to 0.5% by 2020 and by 2025 at latest, depending on IMO's decision by 2018. So the challenges this brings to the shipping industry is both of a technical nature as well as a political and competitive nature. So let's first talk about the technical aspects. Come January, the only readily available drop-in solution to this is to switch fuel to MGO, marine gas oil. That is a low sulfur product. It is also a very different fuel than normal bunker oil. So a lot of companies not used to it will face technical challenges on the vessels. And then there is the price. For a long time, MGO have been trading at about 50% higher price than normal bunker fuel. And with the increased demand in 2015, we can only expect that to increase further. So let me give you a practical example of what that means. So if the differential continues to be at around $300 per ton, and the vessel consumes somewhere between 40 and 70 tons per day, depending on the size and the speed, etc., of the vessel, the cost we're talking about increased is $10,000 to $20,000 per day per vessel. So, as a responsible shipping company, we cannot just sit back and rely on MGO to ensure the most cost-effective way to meet these regulations. I found MGO is just one strand of a four-stream approach. So the second stream to us is low sulfur bunker. And for more than 10 years now, WWL have been running our fleet on a self-imposed sulfur limit of 1.5%. And because of our long experience, we were the partner of choice for Exxon to do full-scale sea trials of what has become the first fully approved ultra-low sulfur fuel oil, ULSFO. So that's a great step forward, but more players are needed in that market to address concerns around price and availability. A third stream is exhaust gas cleaning systems, also called scrubbers. So these remove the sulfur from the vessel exhaust fumes on board, which allows you to continue to run on normal bunker oil. However, there are still many questions around which scrubbers will be accepted and what the effectiveness are. So for some time now, we've been running a full-scale scrubber installations on board one of our vessels and a test project, the MS Torago, together with suppliers and research institutes. And the level of complexity that we have met in those projects have just by far surpassed any expectations we had. So installing a scrubber is a little bit like doing an open heart surgery on a vessel. It's not easy and it's very expensive. So the third stream, and for the longer term, are alternative fuels. So fuel cells and biofuels, etc., are all being explored, but it will take time to get the scale and efficiency out of them. What we believe is the most viable option is LNG, as that is started to be used on short sea vessels, and we see the infrastructure of LNG supplies is starting to be built. But there are still issues around onboard storage. LNG is stored at around -200 degrees Fahrenheit, and the density of LNG is only half or a third of bunker oils. It requires more space. So each of these four streams have their own unique set of technical challenges. Then on the regulatory and political front, the key issue is this. If the regulations are properly implemented, then compliance is the norm and competition is not distorted. However, if enforcement is weak, then a temptation is created to cut corners. And of course, if the financial rewards are large, that's more likely to happen. So today, compliance testing in the European ECA is in the range of 1 out of 1,000 vessels. So 0.1%. And according to the European Commission, half of those vessels are in violation of the sulfur regulations. And there are no plans for how to implement the upcoming regulations. So responsible shipping companies that follow laws and regulations as a matter of course are then, of course, put at a disadvantage relative to those that intentionally are non-compliant. And a 50% cost saving on fuel is a pretty strong incentive to cheat if the risk of getting caught is low and the fines are negligible. So, and of course also the regulations will then not have the intended impact on the environment and human health. So as you may know, WWL and other like-minded shipping companies have for long been pretty vocal in the public debate on this, and having raised this in a number of forums, we found widespread support for robust enforcement. And based on that, we initiated what we named the Trident Alliance, which is a coalition working to bring about robust enforcement. And in just a few months, the Trident Alliance has amassed some 15 member companies, representing about 10% of the world bunker and fuel consumption. And it is already actively working in projects with authorities and other stakeholders around the world to promote the awareness of this issue, as well as advanced technology for monitoring, etc. So this does concern you. The success of the shipping industry in dealing with these matters will have an impact on your supply chains in terms of cost and integrity. And we believe the way to handle this is through a partnership approach. And as shippers, you can have a great impact on this issue by putting clear requirements on your suppliers and following them up. So I would very much like to invite you to collaborate with the Trident Alliance, well knowing that you have been through some of these journeys before. So your inputs and ideas are very much welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. I don't think you can take this last presentation, with a grain of salt at all, because it's not just going to affect the finished vehicle logistics business. It's going to affect every ship. So all your inbound parts that come on all those container ships are going to be affected the same way. So it's going to be massive, and the change is going to happen. I'd like to go to some questions and answers. I have a couple, but I'd rather hear yours first. So don't make me pick you out. So we got a great team of people up here, and they're just dying to hear what you have to say. No one, huh? All right. We'll throw a softball up first. Is somebody back there? Go ahead.
Hi, Art Ruiz with Delta Automotive. Question is for Eric. Eric, what's the average cost to retrofit one of your vessels? I mean, after your initial study here, what's the open heart surgery going to be cost for per vessel, and how many vessels, how many ro-ros are actually going back and forth between Europe and the U.S. that this is going to affect?
So the cost of the scrubbers will depend on if it's retrofit or if it goes into new buildings, and also what type of scrubbers. There are a number of different types of scrubbers. But to give you rough numbers, we're talking about somewhere between $15 and $15 million to install one of these scrubbers. I mean, these are huge, huge installations. We have already ordered, I think, 4 new buildings where we will install scrubbers, and some other companies are doing the same. So you will see in the new building programs now that it's starting to come. But of course, this will take a long time before any significant part of the fleet will have scrubber capacity. And of course, for North America, it's very relevant because we will have the ECA on the whole American coast.
Mr. Jankowski. Hold on, we're going to get you a mic, Jerry.
Jerry Jankowski with Global Dynamic Logistics, and this question is for Eric. Right now, ECA, at least for the near term, applies to North America, North Europe, the Baltic. What's the long-range forecast for other regions of the world implementing ECA?
That's a good question, and I wish I had the answer. But this is certainly being considered by a number of other countries. We know Australia is looking into it now, and I'm sure there are parts of Asia where this will come as well, and bigger parts of Europe and South America. So I think we've just seen the beginning, but I couldn't give you any dates or anything for when this will expand, but I certainly think it will.
Mr. Mason.
Yes, Brian Mason from Toyota. Question for Linda. Regarding the hiring, you've staffed up a lot of young people. We've heard at past conferences that there's great difficulty in staffing younger truck drivers, and you seem to be successful at being able to staff and hire younger people for rail jobs. Is there some secret that, or some process that the railroads discovered to entice those young people into those transportation careers that maybe could help truck?
I think there's probably an easy answer and there's probably a much longer answer. But fundamentally, you have to have a package that attracts employees. So I think if you look at the entire package of pay, benefits, long-term opportunity, the railroads have been able to historically point toward a total compensation package and an opportunity that works. We do struggle, really with the new generation being much more concerned about work-life integration, right? So railroads are a very hardworking culture. As a rule of thumb, and have not always been as sensitive to some of those work-life integration issues as they may have been in the past. There's certainly challenges with that going forward, but certainly a strong recognition that communication tools and how we manage that is a big deal. But it's really, when you look at that package and look at that opportunity, there are train and engine employees who can make six-figure salaries with overtime and additional work there that they view as something that is very valuable and important to their families, and they make that work. So that's a fairly easy answer. It's more complex than that, but I think that's the fundamental.
Hi, Dave Michelson with Tesla Motors. Questions for Robert, predominantly. We know hours of service is definitely affecting the driver pool out there. Are we seeing an increase in availability for maybe dray carriers and more short-haul closed-loop carriers as a result of them wanting to avoid the long hauls?
I don't know if I can really answer that question for you since I deal with the automotive outbound. But in talking to some of my colleagues in the building, some of the major effect on the driver shortage and some of the numbers and the high turnover occur in the truckload sector, which would be long haul. I think in the LTL drayage local operations side, the driver retention has been higher, and they don't have as much of a problem. The issue is pay and as Linda alluded to, the quality of life, work-home environment. Drivers want to get home at night or just be gone for a day or two.
Louis?
Hi. This is a question that came through on our Automotive live stream from a gentleman, Vivek Luthra, who's a logistics professional in Germany, but watching the live stream with great interest. This is for Bob again. Are automobile truckers subject to compliance checks by the shippers during the contract period? What is the trend?
Could you repeat the question, Louis?
Are automobile truckers subject to compliance checks by shippers, by the OEMs, I guess, during the contract period?
I think we'd have to refer that question back. Kurt's right behind you, nodding up and down.
Yeah, Kirk Williams, Proficient Auto Transport. Absolutely. Most of our contracts now with the OEMs actually have stipulations in there regarding our safety scores and the ability to terminate agreements if we fail to meet the safety scores. A lot of this information is public for anyone to look at in terms of the safety and what's going on with the driver. So yeah, it's absolutely a critical thing.
Thank you. And just to say for the live stream, that was Kirk, who's also the president of Auto Haulers Association.
I got one for the panel, and we can start anywhere you want, but we heard a lot of talk pre-recession about carbon dioxide emissions and taxation. Could you, maybe starting with Linda, we'll work our way down again, tell us what you've heard, how it may affect your industry going forward?
Sure, I'll take a shot at that. Clearly the emissions on locomotives are a big deal, and so, there's continuous work on improving the quality of the emissions, particularly in yard switching operations and over the road, over the road. I will tell you the railroads have a significant advantage in terms of being green and in, how many miles of freight, how many miles we can haul a ton of freight on a gallon of fuel. That gives us a distinct advantage in that area, so that helps, but there's constant pressure on making sure that that's improved, that we're looking at new technologies and moving forward.
I would say we have the good fortune of being in an attainment area for air quality, but one of the things that we're really looking at is the cold ironing and the infrastructure that would be necessary to do that if that becomes a competitive issue.
Mm-hmm.
Bill, I think it's reflective in one of my slides. We're going to have new regulations coming out for emissions in our fuel economy, greenhouse gases, carbon, whatever. Right now, within the industry in Washington and regulators, we're discussing who's going to be responsible for what component. It's going to be mainly left up to the engine and truck manufacturers to deal with it, and we have to live with it. Right now, as I think most carriers, if not all car haulers, are enrolled in the EPA SmartWay program, which is a program put on by the Environmental Protection Agency that's geared toward reducing greenhouse gases and carbon footprint on the trucks.
And is that carbon footprint tax or whatever they're going to put in, Bob, probably just going to be passed on through the cost of the engine or the components?
Yeah.
Okay. Eric?
Well, right now, I think the focus on the shipping side is on the sulfur, as you understand. I'm sure there will be regulations coming up on the CO2 side as well. And then, of course, on our terminals, in our trucking fleets, in all our land-based operations, I mean, we certainly work on CO2 emissions. Also, when we do networking studies with our customers, this is certainly one of the factors we look at when we optimize networks. It's the emissions that is caused by the network.
Another thing I didn't really hear from any of you today, and it may affect some of you more than others, obviously, is CTPAT and the effects CTPAT's had on your organizations, especially when it comes to security, not only for cargo, but for people, especially cross-border activities. And I don't know, maybe again, Linda, if you want to touch on that, or you guys are doing a lot down there.
That's not a huge area of my expertise,
Okay.
right? I mean, we certainly make sure that we follow those rules because particularly crossing the southern border, anything that prevents you from a fluid operation is problematic, right? So you're dealing with customs, dealing with the whole flow there. So it's not been a huge deal other than compliance is just not optional.
Okay. And the reason I bring it up is obviously give AIAG a plug, but it's one of the issues that we're offering to the OEMs right now. We've had 5 or 6 of the OEMs enroll in our CT-PAT program, and it's coming down the line because they're going to have enforcement issues with all their carriers going forward, whether they be domestic or international. So.
But I'll just add, I mean, one of the things that's frustrating from the port perspective and our terminal operators is that we're regulated by the Coast Guard, and almost everything that the CT-PAT program is looking for in terms of security and access controls is required by the Coast Guard, but you can't turn around and give all of that facility security planning to customs. You have to go through a completely separate, alternate, siloed approach, and that was a really frustrating experience. The fact that these two agencies are making you go through almost the same process, but through a different, different regulation.
So you're required to certify both through Coast Guard and customs?
So the port itself is not required to go through CT-PAT, but we went through the process to make sure that in terms of supply chain, anyone using our facility can maintain that CT-PAT certification. But it was just a very challenging from the fact that the Coast Guard also requires us to do the same thing.
I think that's interesting because both the Coast Guard and Border and Customs Security are under the same agency, Homeland Security. So I think that's another example of just how screwed up the bureaucracy is in Washington.
Unintended circumstances, right? Eric?
No, nothing more to add.
Okay, okay. Anyone else got anything else out there? All right, one of the external factors, and Linda touched on this, so I'm not going to pick on her first, but going forward is, again, employees, right? And where are we going to get our next generation of logistics employees? I know you probably all have internal programs that you're working with. Can you share something maybe in particular that one of your companies are doing to, look for the next generation of logistics managers and executives? Mr. Farrell?
You had to pick on me, huh, Bill?
Yeah.
I really don't know. That's not my expertise.
Does the ATA have any programs, community outreach programs? Or?
Not for the younger workers force.
Except working with the military, I know, right?
We're working with the military. Some carriers and some of our state trucking associations are gearing up and joining with community colleges and doing outreach and trying to get them to consider truck driving, even to the point of going to high schools because, by you're 16, 17, 18 years old, you kind of figure out what you may want to do and trying to get them into the work pool, if you will. But the problem is, Bill, you can't drive interstate commerce in this country unless you're 21 years old. Mm-hmm. Now, you can drive intrastate, but you can't drive interstate commerce.
I didn't realize that.
And by that time, most people are 21 years old, they've already staked out a career.
Is that something that needs to be changed? Is it something that needs to be lobbied about? Or is it on anybody's radar screen, I should say, right?
It's on the radar, but it's low. It's down there in regard to...
it's not at drone height yet, right?
It's not drone height. It's trying to convince people that you should change the federal regulation and let some 18, 19-year-old kid get behind a 80,000-pound truck. They're like, no. Even though you can probably do the research and the studies that would show what level of safety they operate on versus an older driver. Right now, there's just no stomach for it.
Evan, I'm sorry, go ahead, Linda.
Oh, no, I was just going to throw one more diversity plug in here, right? So how many women truck drivers are there, right? 14% of women working, 14% of engineering positions are filled by women. We have a significant diversity opportunity with minorities and women in filling some of these jobs. We reach out, again, at the middle school level, right, which is where if you do the research on it, it's one thing to talk to people who are already in engineering school. It's another thing to reach our daughters in middle school and say, this is a cool thing to do. You got to start young. You've got to expand your thinking about what works. I know I read something about truck carriers who were adjusting the seating in the rigs so that smaller people could actually manage the rig better. I mean, I think there's just a whole subsection of the population that isn't being tapped the way we could tap them. And there's all kinds of other work with the military, with recruiting, right, with an ability to look at really good, significant, high-paying jobs in a lot of cases that people don't consider. You know, working in our mechanical shops and working on train crews are not the typical thing that most parents are encouraging their children to do. But there's opportunity there. There's opportunity there. And that's a lot of what we're thinking in terms of when we talk about communication and outreach and how we use tools and how you think about work-life integration, how that works. But if we're going to be successful, we have to be able to reach that generation. It's really important.
Off the top of my head, I don't know how many women there are truck drivers, but there are a lot of women truck drivers. In some segments of the industry, they have husband and wife sleeper berths. Linda mentioned technicians. It's interesting. We think the driver shortage is here and now, and it is. In speaking with people in our technology and TMZ, Technology Maintenance Council, they're raising a red flag that today's truck driver shortage, tomorrow it's going to be technician shortage. We're not going to have any.
Evan, can you speak from Rhode Island point of viewpoint as far as, you know, you got a whole line of people that I know are, you know, not, I won't say young anymore, okay? And that goes from your labor force, the longshoremen, all the way down to the guys who work in the processing facilities and stuff like that. Is the state of Rhode Island or the county offering any kind of money for training up your way?
Not to be the doom and gloom panel, but I mean, one of the things that we see as the ports and the terminal operators is the longshore labor tends to be tracking the same as the truck drivers, that it's an aging workforce, that we don't see the next generation coming in. You know, one of the things that we really track really closely is to make sure that our labor force is growing to meet the demand of the growing ship calls. But yeah, the community college networks, I think throughout the country are doing a really good job of trying to match those skills. There was a lot of, I think, you know, Rhode Island had the highest unemployment rate. I think we beat Michigan in something. And we had a lot of federal dollars. So, but I think those jobs, those skills are really focused on the processing side. A lot of the technicians, a lot of the skilled positions are going on the processing as opposed to the terminal labor. So it's definitely something we're watching.
Bill, I'd like to add something else.
Sure.
We've heard a lot, and definitely in the press, we've read a lot about V2V technology, vehicle-to-vehicle technology, vehicles talking to each other, basically as a safety mechanism. Well, take it one step further. Can we have a driverless truck someday?
Yep. Eric, you want to speak on the shipping side?
I think what you're talking about on the truck driving side here for us is very much of a global issue. We see the same in Europe, the challenges recruiting truck drivers, but even more so on the shipping side with the recruiting mariners. So to us, this is certainly a global challenge which we're dealing with. And even more so in emerging markets like China, India, etc., to recruit people into our industry and to retain them is something we're very, very conscious about.
I mean, I thought it was very interesting when Louis brought this topic up because, again, as an industry, sometimes I don't think we do a very good job of blowing our own horns. I mean, I live down in Charleston where, you know, Boeing just put an aerospace factory, you know, airplane factory in the last few years, and the amount of money they were able to receive from the state and in some cases the counties for training was just incredible. But the ports that are in our home states and right where we live provide so much economic impact, not just from the imports and exports, but the domestics too, right? From the trains and the trucks, and I don't think we do a good job of sometimes raising that level of awareness. And I don't know if it's got to be done through the ports or through our industry associations, but we need to do a better job. Kurt?
Kirk Williams with Proficient Auto Transport and also the Auto Haulers Association. I think there's two things. One is for students, for professional managerial jobs. I think there's a lot of universities, great universities in the United States that have transportation logistics programs, and they're excellent. I think even Wayne State here in Detroit, I'm actually on a board of advisors for one of the leading schools in the country on logistics, and we've had competitions with universities throughout the United States coming in. I mean, I think there's a great amount of students that are going to be entering the workforce in the managerial side. But I think there's a bigger issue is on the labor side, the blue collar side. And I really think, a big part, I'm going to talk about a little bit tomorrow in my presentation, but a big part of it's, the trucking industry itself has an image problem. And I think that's really the biggest issue, is that we have done a terrible job of promoting our industry. We have a great industry, we have great salaries, great benefits. I mean, we compare with everyone. Every one of the carriers that attends this conference has great programs, but we've done a terrible job of promoting the trucking industry. I think the ATA is starting to work on that. I think they're trying to put together a program to promote the industry better, but it is a problem. So if you were to sit at home and talk to your kids in college or high school and talk about career paths, often the trucking industry doesn't come up as a top priority, and it should be, because it's a great career. I was at the Bonn conference earlier this year and was networking with a number of auto carriers in Germany and throughout Europe. And it was great for me to talk to them, because they're having the same problems that we are here too. It used to be considered more of a profession. They took a lot of pride in it, and they're having the same problem. They're having to go out and recruit drivers from other countries, particularly more of the third world countries, to come in and drive. So this is a universal problem that we need to work on. And the carriers need to be involved, but everyone really does, because it's it's the future of our industry.
Kurt's correct. The American Trucking Association is launching a new advertising campaign, if you will, on our image. The tagline is "Trucking Moving America Forward." They're in the initial stages of gathering financial support, and I know that Jack Cooper Transport has made a major commitment for the next 5 years toward that campaign, and thank you. And there'll be more of that to come. You'll be rolling out. They have to raise their initial $1 million, I believe, close to it, and they'll be rolling out, and we'll see more of it.
Thanks. Mike Sturgeon, please. Identify yourself.
Thank you. Mike Sturgeon from ECG, which is the European Association of Vehicle Logistics, so the closest equivalent we have to AIAG in Europe. And I just wanted to pick up on what Kurt was saying there, and a couple of the others. The driver shortage thing was becoming a real issue before the crisis in Europe. It went away because everybody reduced capacity, and driver shortage became less of an issue with that. It's absolutely back on the radar now. There are drivers from Eastern Europe prepared to work across Europe, but generally speaking, people's expectations have changed. If people want to drive a truck, they want to be able to do it in a shirt and tie and get home at the end of the day. They don't want to go and sleep in a cab. We've got issues with the member states in Europe. Nobody is investing in facilities for these guys. You don't get showers and toilets at the rest stops. There aren't secure areas. We've had, fortunately it's stopped now, but we had a spate of people who decided it was fun to set fire to the car on the back and burn out the entire load while the driver was asleep in his cab. We had that happening across a number of countries in Europe. And I've got to be honest, I mean, I've loaded a truck, but I wouldn't want to do it in the middle of winter, in the dark, in the snow, in the ice. And it's a very, very tough job to persuade people to come and do that, because there's plenty of truck driving jobs that are much more pleasant.
Amen, brother. Right back to, is that Mr. Swinnis?
So I guess this may be a question for Linda. So you talked a little bit about positive train control. Do you see a point in time in the not too distant future where we have unmanned trains essentially as the norm? It seems like you guys are further down that road than anyone else right now.
That's a very loaded question. Louis, did you plant that one? So the technology for remote control trains exists. The debate and the concern is about the safety of not having human beings on that train, right? So that's a very hot, debated topic, and I don't think the answer won't be a can we, it's a should we. And I don't think I'm in a position to predict the result of that debate at this point. I don't know if any of my rail colleagues have anything they want to add to that one, but that's fundamentally the debate. Technology could make that happen. The politics and the concerns may not have that be the case.
Okay. Well, maybe just to sum up, as far as regulations and regulatory environment, I've never seen regulations that didn't end up in costing more money for the consumer. So buyer beware as we go forward. Please give a big round of applause to the panel. And we got a break coming up, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thank you.